Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise the Fly podcast. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston, Alec, and Florian. Glad to have you all guys here. So, as a part of our broader education integration discussions that we've been having, I decided it would be, I think, a good idea to sort of unpack some implications of my speech that I gave at the Old Glory Club. It was a sort of right-wing conference where I gave a speech primarily against technology, but there was a lot of layers of critique to it, including elements of the cultural war and so on. But education does show up in it, and there's a sort of implied educational principles that are in it. Okay, and so afterwards, a lot of people who were there said it was one of the most popular speeches, but there's so much in there that people were like, well, what does all this mean? They got bits and pieces of it, but not necessarily everything that I wanted them to. And I think one way to help people tie this all together is to look at how I reference education. And I start by referencing the culture war, right? Because my argument is that the culture war is a frozen conflict led by counter gangs. So just to reiterate briefly, frozen conflict is a conflict in which there's no actual peace treaty, but there's no active hostilities. North and South Korea is a perfect example. So theoretically, it could open up at any time. A counter gang is where one agent fighting another group creates a pseudo group to compete with that other group in order to weaken its power. So in Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising, Frank Kitson created other black nationalist groups to undercut their power and defeat them. And that's probably what I think the culture war is. Not that everybody in it is a counter gang, but the leaders usually are. That's my argument. Because what led me to that conclusion was why does the right always play to lose? And in this regard, what I mean is the left just had a chokehold on education. I mean, if you look at the culture war from the perspective of the right, has had a chokehold on education for at least 100 years. And the right just will not do anything about it. So if you were like in a liberal community, right, they would heavily encourage you to go into politics. They'd heavily encourage you to go into education, especially education. And there's a whole conduit pipeline of liberal children being trained as teachers to go into education, to propagate their values. And the right just does not do that. There is no conduit for young right-wing men to go into education. And in fact, they don't have a solution to education because their solution is to defund it. So, I mean, yeah, our current system is terrible, but having no educational system at all is really terrible too. And so my argument, at least when it first shows up in the speech, is they just cave on this issue. And it's like, why? Right? Because remember, this is a culture war. So in a culture war, you're supposed to be producing cultural artifacts, literature, music, all this other stuff. And what sits beneath all that is a sort of education, a concept of the world and of reality. And the right's just not doing that. And I'm like, okay, well, why? If they were serious, they would be. So the question then becomes, okay, well, why aren't they serious? I mean, a lot of rank and file people are probably just not serious as a matter of principle or course. But with regards to the leadership, I've begun to wonder if, well, maybe they're not serious because they're in the employ of someone else, right? And that's where the idea that counter gang comes from. Well, the application of the idea. The idea was introduced to me by Caleb Mapa in his book, Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, where he argues that the synthetic left, the modern left, is a synthetic movement used by capital to foment wars in like Eastern Europe, for example. And so in that regard, I'm like, yeah, this is totally a joke. There's no, because how does the left win, right? The right thinks that they can just outbreed the left, but then they send their kids to school, and then those kids go to school, they get consumed into the Borg, and so it's a totally fatuous argument that you can outbreed the left because on the right, you're just going to send their kids to those schools. You'd have to be sending them to like-minded institutions. Now, the problem is there were, there's parochial schools, of course, like if you're Lutheran or Catholic or even Baptist, I think have them. But then we have the problem of conquests, second law and third law. Any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's controlled by a cabal of its enemies. Now, even otherwise relatively conservative institutions, like say the Southern Baptist Convention, is that's not an educational institution, of course, it's a church, but has begun to waffle on the edges with regards to some of these modern issues from a point of view of a conservative. And then the question is, okay, well, even explicitly right-wing organizations are now being undercut, let alone institutions of education. I argue that's in large part because it's just follow the money. These institutions need to acquire money somehow. And as the culture around them changes, they still need to have that income coming in to keep the institutions going. And so there's just this countervailing force at this point, which is so massive that they can't possibly resist it as long as they want to remain within the paradigm. Some sort of earlier, more robust attempt might have worked, but it just didn't manifest. So that was the first part. The second part I bring up education is with regards to figuring out how to understand and perceive the world around you. So the general principles of education that I'm advocating, you can find with the ancient Greeks. The idea that one's rational. So Plato gives us the idea of the tripartite soul, the black horse of appetite, the white horse of spirit, and the charioteer. The charioteer ought to be the one in control, guiding the two horses, because if they work together under his control, everything works swimmingly. The problem is they're both prone to go in their own directions. And so through proper education, man is enabled to think rationally. Otherwise, either appetite or spirit will take over. Aristotle argues in the Politics that, since human desires are infinite and it's impossible to gratify human desires, education must be included in order to teach people to be satisfied with less, which is the opposite of what modern capitalism would teach you to do today. Have as much as possible. And so because the basis here is that rational thinking itself is something that has to be cultivated. We're not rational agents a la some sort of like a market framework where they assume rational agents in the market making decisions. Not by nature we're not. I mean, we have the capabilities if properly cultivated. So the key part here of education is to create the preconditions for rational discourse, whereby you get individuals to control themselves, self-control, which actually the entire government, and this ties into government in two ways. First of all, the decline of civil society and democratic government in the United States is directly related to the end of the liberal arts education. Well, if you read the Greeks and the Romans or the founding fathers, they're going to tell you that you can't engage in a representative form of government without being trained how to do so. And that training, of course, is through the education of reading about other men who did this in the past and similar systems. That's all been scrapped. So now, of course, people have no reference point for how this is even supposed to work. And then the second point with regards to the education, with regards to politics, is self-government. It's literally a philosophical concept before it's a political concept. So the idea of political self-government assumes that the individual is a self-governing agent. But that assumption can only be maintained if you have cultural pressures and educational pressures that create conditions under which such an individual would, in fact, be self-governing. These things are not to be taken for granted, either rational actors in a marketplace of ideas or the market itself, or self-governing agents in a political system. And so by to just briefly outline this concept of education, by learning by returning to the classical liberal arts, rooted primarily in what we see with the sort of classical Greek method of education, you control or modify the individual's behaviors so that they can then exercise their rational faculties to then teach them how to maintain self-control and learn how to engage with civil society, creating the preconditions for what made the United States a great country in the first place. So that's what I'm getting at primarily in that section. Now, Keith, what are some of your thoughts on how, or questions maybe even about how education affects what I said in the essay?
Well, there's a lot of different things that are interrelated there. When it comes to the question of the cultural values that are reflected in the educational system, the issue there is that in any kind of system, the educational system, for the most part, is going to reflect the dominant zeitgeist. That is, whatever cultural values are prevalent in the wider society, and particularly among the elite. And that can change over time. For instance, I mentioned this on some program recently. I don't know if it was this one or another one, but I had a friend of mine that he was a bit older than me, probably about 20 years older than me. 25 years older than me, that back in the early 1960s, when he graduated from high school in New York City, you had to take a loyalty oath to graduate from high school, meaning that basically you had to promise you weren't a communist and that you weren't going to overthrow the government, that you were going to be a good American or whatever. And he was part of a group of student activists that actually got loyalty oaths removed from the New York City public school system. Now, so this wasn't some backwoods Alabama school district. This was New York City. Right? Now, nowadays, something like that would be laughable, but I could very easily see a loyalty oath developing today where you promise to reduce your carbon footprint and fight racism and affirm LGBT, acceptance or whatever. So the educational institutions and cultural institutions generally reflect the dominant zeitgeist. So the people who are not part of the dominant zeitgeist are always in the unenviable position of having to become the zeitgeist if they want to have influence. And that's always going to be an uphill battle. It's certainly true that conservatives, particularly religious and social conservatives, have tried to develop counter institutions like private schools and church schools and that kind of stuff and private universities to counter the dominant zeitgeist. That's why you have places like, that on a more extreme end, like Liberty University or Regent, maybe in a more moderate sense, Hillsdale or Grove City College or somewhere like that. And then you have parochial school and all that, as Todd mentioned. But any kind of counter institution, or you want to call it a counter gang or whatever, is going to have an uphill battle initially, because you're going to be looking for things like funding. As Todd was saying, what are you going to do about funding? What are you going to do about gaining popular sympathy? So it's always going to be an uphill struggle. And until you somehow manage to become the dominant zeitgeist. Now, I don't know that conservatives are necessarily going to become the dominant zeitgeist anytime soon. That seems to be they seem to be swimming against the tides. I mean, maybe not. I mean, things can often change rapidly in unexpected ways. But I see this as a wider cultural issue. It's not merely about education, because you could apply the same critique to the arts, to the entertainment industry, to even today, advertising, journalism, any field that deals with ideas. So it's a question of becoming the dominant cultural force if you want institutions to reflect your values. Just like in the Middle Ages, obviously institutions reflected Roman Catholic values, or as I mentioned earlier, in the 1950s, institutions reflected American exceptionalism, and in other countries we would see much different value systems in many instances. So, and it's certainly true that a counterculture can become the dominant culture. I mean, there are a lot of things that, say, in the 1960s or 70s were part of the counterculture that are now mainstream and normalized and hegemonic. The gay rights thing is probably the most obvious example, but so is a lot of the green-oriented stuff, and obviously a lot of stuff about race and a lot of other things as well. So that's really what you're facing, I think. I think that's the key issue. You've got to be the dominant zeitgeist if you want cultural institutions, including education, to reflect your value system.
The only thing I'll say to that, Keith, is real quickly, throughout the Middle Ages, the Jews, and then in other parts of the world like Japan, the Jesuits were able to maintain a cohesive educational structure against the zeitgeist.
Well, there's stuff like that now. I mean, there are certainly subcultures that are insular in that way. I mean, the Jews, the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews are an example. The Amish are an example. To some degree, the Mormons may be an example. So that's certainly possible, but it's still going to be an uphill battle.
All right, Alec.
Well, Todd, I'm going to give you a different perspective in response to your speech. That what I see in your discussion that you're doing is that you're discussing the question of culture wars. Is the conservative culture ever going to recover from this culture of machine indoctrination, this culture of wokeness, and so on and so on? I'm going to give you a definitive answer. Yes, it will. We will recover from this, but not for the reason that you're thinking. See, the solution that you're imagining is that possibly somehow conservatives will reassert their dominance. That's not going to happen. What will probably happen is that the baby boomers will die off, which in fact they will, and in 2030s, our generation, American millennials, we will be the dominant voice, and we will be much less interested in the culture war. American culture will enter the first turning phase of Neil Hoff's theory, which is reminiscent of what happened in the 1940s and the 1950s, and also in the aftermath of the Civil War. You see, the baby boomer generation that raised us, that's been the dominant voice in our heads, has taught us to be value conscious, to be culturally informed. There was Andrew Breitbart used to say, politics is downstream from culture. That's a very boomerish perspective. It is this way because, unfortunately, baby boomers are still alive and well, and they dominate our institutions. But not to worry, give it another decade, and we won't be hearing from them anymore. And what we'll see is the realignment of parties. That we're not going to have Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. We're not going to hear about Bill Clinton. All these people will be a laughingstock of our past. We're going to see a whole new generation of politicians emerge who are neither woke, nor are they evangelical, nor are they even dogmatic. We will see a very pragmatic generation that's entirely disabused of the fallacies that bind us to the values of the baby boomers. To give you a clear example of what I'm talking about, look at the career of Bob Dole. Bob Dole is a famous GI generation politician who belongs to the same generational archetype as we do, the civic or the hero generation. Now, Bob Dole was much more moderate than Ronald Reagan, to say nothing of Donald Trump. Bob Dole was better in the Nixonian tradition, and Nixon himself also a GI politician who synthesized points of view of the left and the right. He was Keynesian, he was for the Clean Air Act, he founded the EPA, and he had many Southern Democrats voting for him. In 1968, it wasn't a shame for a left-leaning person to say that they're considering voting for Nixon. Yet if you do this now at a woke convention, you will probably be murdered. So that is the difference, and this is what we're going to be heading into. We're going to be heading into a much more pragmatic era, where culture war is not going to be won or lost, neither. It will simply dissipate. It's going to be an epiphenomenon. It will wither away on its own volition. It requires a vigorous and vociferous clamor of the baby boomer generation to exist, and it is now in its dying cataclysms. I do not see a future for culture wars in the next decade. We're slowly but surely we're moving away from it. And you may think, well, Donald Trump is alive and well. Biden, a lot of baby boomers are still running the show. Well, do you think they're immortal? Do you think they're like that demon from Russian mythology, Koshay the Deathless, who looks as pale as a corpse and is actual skeleton who torments humanity for all eternity? No, that nightmare will never come to pass. These people are gonna die, and they'll take their moral crusades with them. And we, as millennials, and a small minority of Gen X leaders, will have to take a more pragmatic approach. Because when it comes to it, we vote against boomers. We vote for one boomer because we hate the other one more. Nobody in their right mind in our age gap, neither in ours, nor in Keith's, nor in Florian's, neither Gen X nor millennial really cares much for boomers. We don't trust them, we don't like them, and we can't wait to see them go so we can finally begin rebuilding the country.
Yeah, I'll just make one small point of clarification. I didn't actually argue that the right could win the culture war. I argued that the culture war was created as a smokescreen to win the class war. That was the basis of the argument. Florian.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, I agree with Aleksey and Keith, and I think one reason that the right doesn't seemingly play to win is they seemingly get distracted by shiny objects like CNN interviews, right? Or you have these influencers like Jordan Peterson and Michael Malice and others, which are great, but they for example, they could sign people up to register to vote, but they rather dissipate that decision power that the audience has by just selling them their books, right? And then the people buy a book and think, okay, so that's my vote for conservatism. and others from the conservative movement or in the conservative sphere, they just want to retreat to some sort of pastoralism, right? Homeschool, form your own community, and as other people pointed out, that's basically abdicating the power you could have, right? It seems like they don't really want to take part in the class or in the class war, I'm saying now, culture war either, because if you think about it, one of the counter gangs in the culture war might be the Chamber of Commerce, for example. But I don't see any conservative, at least from the new generation, that would really want to be part of Chamber of Commerce, because they are not really getting in there either, right? So there's room for a third way, as Aleksey said, and you'll have more and more people that are in the up and coming conservative part. They don't want to be part of the culture war. They go a separate way, and I think one of the ways, one of the tools that are there to do that is, for example, Bitcoin and blockchain, where you basically have you can create a shadow economy completely independent from any of the other economies, because on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchains, you're just a number, right? There's no person really that you can connect with. It could be a neighbor that is under that number on Bitcoin, could be somebody far away, and but that's also a tool to extract yourself from any group belongings you would have in society. You can extract yourself from being participant of the culture war. And then I agree with Aleksey that that all the baby boomers, basically, that there will be a distant thought. But one thing, and I haven't quite understood that for myself, what the solution to that is. Right now, conservatives don't seem to have really an own educational vision, right? Basically, anything that the conservatives do is defined by the left. They're just against the left. And I thought hard, I mean, what is the educational concept of the right? Yeah, maybe the nuclear family and teaching boys that they are boys and girls that they are girls. And it's basically rejection of transgenderism. But it's not an own standing. It's not an individual, independent vision that there is. It's just something we don't want. That what the left wants, and maybe that is a danger that may keep us a little bit longer in the culture war. But in the end, if the next generation is more pragmatically minded, then the educational vision will come along eventually.
Well, I like where you left off there, Florian. The idea of this lack of an educational vision. That's sort of what I was getting at in criticizing the idea that, on the one hand, they're just not the left, whatever that means, right? You just take the opposite position the left does. But then also the idea that they don't, not only do they not have that positive vision, they don't have a system or an engine for creating academics who will then propagate, quote unquote, conservative values, unquote. And so this really is, again, the problem, because if we look at the United States in general, no surprise, almost all teachers are going to be leftists, because that's the demographic that's investing resources into their children to become teachers. And the right's just not, it's not that there's a competition and the right lost. The right just isn't doing it. There isn't a competition going on. They're not training their children to be teachers. And it's a mind-boggling thing to me that, if you don't, because even if you just have like this, like, I don't know, null culture where, it's just the Chamber of Commerce buying and selling, you won't have a way of life. Within 1 to 2 generations, they'll just have, random people on the street buying and selling, and that's it. There won't even be a culture. It's just a null. So like the conservative culture is kind of a null culture, and that it just doesn't represent anything. Now, when we think of like conservatives in the past, like say Europe in the 19th century, or even like parochial Americans in the deep South or the West, these were people that actually lived in real embedded communities and weren't either living in urban cramped areas or heavily mediated by technique with things like the radio, the television, the digital space, and the modern economy. And so what ends up happening is all of us have to continually shift towards this mechanical civilization in order to function economically. we become more and more removed from each other and from environmental conditions, which are the preconditions for forming communities. And so without any actual community, you just have like an image, a representation that doesn't actually mean what it's supposed to mean. And, you know, a lot of people fall for that. And of course that just means you don't have anything to bring to the table. There's no actual vision of an education. And see, what was surprising to me, this is sort of my own experience here, is growing up, there was this sort of, I thought, a push for classical education in these circles, but it really wasn't nearly as big as I thought it was, nor as effective as I thought it was. And, you know, as I've gotten older and gone to these people's websites and looked at the materials they're producing, it's just heavily commodified garbage. It's not like real classical. Okay, so if you want to see what a real classically educated man is, read C.S. Lewis. You know, read some of the statesmen, read some of the founding fathers. These are men that were classically educated. You know one when you see one because you know what it looks like on the other end of this process. I don't know anybody today that's like that. Even people that were allegedly going to these schools or taking these curricula. So the point is, none of these people, well, even if they had good intentions, were actually producing a citizen or an individual who was classically educated. And so I argue that just used to be the default up until 1945 when it was all replaced with STEM, more or less. And you can read The Closing of the American Mind, where Alan Bloom talks about how the early radicals in the 60s were singing, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. They were undermining the entire project there, which removed all impediments to, you know, the broader economic forces that they were complaining about, as which proves, I think, that they were just synthetic leftists. You know, they actually removed impediments to the economic forces that they were complaining about as leftists. Keith.
Well, one of the core components of Todd's presentation at the conference was the idea that the culture war is a mask for the class war. And I think that that's 100% correct. But I would approach that in a somewhat different angle than a lot of people who argue that would. For instance, it's interesting how conservatives and Marxists often overlap in their analysis of the culture war. For instance, your more mainstream conservatives like, I don't know, your Fox News talking heads or conservative politicians like Ted Cruz or Mark Levine, people like that will say, well, this woke, politically correct stuff is communism or it's Marxism. And some anti-woke liberals like James Lindsay make that kind of argument. And even some paleocons like Bill Lynn make that argument. And then ironically, some Marxists like serious Stalinists make that argument. They'll say, but from the opposite end of the spectrum, they'll say, well, the purpose of the culture war is that the CIA co-opted the Frankfurt School's cultural Marxism in order to make Marxism just about cultural stuff, and then that distracts the workers from the class struggle, and then it's also used to foment color revolutions in anti-American countries, and like Venezuela or whatever. That's pretty much the tanky or Marxist-Leninist Stalinist view. So it's interesting how the conservative views and the communist views overlap, albeit from opposite perspectives. I tend to agree with some of that analysis, but I think it's a very surface level analysis. I did a presentation on this program once about woke, in terms of what it is on an intellectual level, from the point of view of intellectual history. But from a socioeconomic perspective, I'd argue that the culture war is at least parallel to and a smokescreen for a class war. But I think it's not so much a class war comparable to the historic labor versus management class war, say the 1900, the late industrial revolution. I'd say it's more like the class war of the early industrial revolution, where if you look at the early industrial revolution, the class war wasn't proletarians versus capitalists. It was the bourgeoisie versus the aristocracy and the traditional elite. And I think that that's kind of what's happening today. I think what we're experiencing in today's world is something very similar to the 19th century, where just like in the 19th century, we had the Industrial Revolution. And out of that, we saw the rise of this new, larger, increasingly dominant middle class, the bourgeoisie, and that was associated with free trade and classical liberalism and all that kind of stuff. In recent times, we've seen the development of something similar, which is the digital revolution. And the digital revolution is superseding the industrial revolution, and it's associated with globalization and neoliberalism and all these kinds of things. And the digital revolution and everything related to it is now replacing the dominance of the old industrial bourgeoisie with a new kind of, like what I call the neo-bourgeoisie, which is this new capital, this your tech oligarchs, and then along with that, this rising middle class of professional managerial people, as opposed to traditional business people and white collar workers and that kind of stuff. And I think that's the real class war right now. It's like Thomas Piketty, the French economist who's on the left. He says that the real class war today is between what he calls the Brahmin left, that is highly educated knowledge workers in these new high-tech driven industries, versus the merchant right, which is the more traditional business class, particularly the small to medium-sized business class. And then the cultural expression of that is that the rising new middle class or new elite tend to be more culturally, leftward or cosmopolitan or what heterogeneous or whatever, whereas the traditional middle class, the traditional bourgeoisie, the industrial bourgeoisie, tends to be more socially conservative, comparatively speaking. So it's sort of like a replay of the historic battle between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, with the industrial bourgeoisie now playing the role of the aristocracy, and then this new middle class generated by the Industrial Revolution being the current equivalent of the bourgeoisie of the 18th and 19th century. And then where that aligns with class in a wider sense is that nowadays you frequently find the traditional working class, what Americans think of as the working to middle class, which is basically the upper strata working class, or the sinking sectors of the working class. You find those sectors tend to be aligned with the merchant right or with the industrial bourgeoisie. You see, like the Republican Party is shaping up with that kind of alignment. The traditional working class, along with the small capital, medium-sized capital, old industrial bourgeoisie like the Kochs and that kind of stuff. All of that is in the same camp, and that's very similar to how in the Industrial Revolution, the peasants, the craftsmen, the small artisans, all of that kind of stuff often sided with the reactionaries, what the Marxists would think of as the reactionaries, which was like the pro-aristocracy, pro-church, pro-traditional monarchy. And then on the other hand, in the early Industrial Revolution, the rising proletariat, like the urbanized proletariat, was often on the same side as the bourgeoisie because they were both fighting the traditional elites, and largely for the cause of republicanism and the Enlightenment and that kind of stuff. And that's exactly what you have now. You have this new middle class that's aligned with the new elites, the tech oligarchs, and then rising sectors of the working class, which is like upwardly mobile minorities and people like that. All of that, it tends to be on one side of the fence. And then what they're basically doing is trying to consolidate not the Enlightenment, but the 1968 revolution, the 68ers. And then interestingly, just like in the Industrial Revolution, members of the old elite that managed to successfully reinvent themselves as a capitalist class or were aligned with the capitalist class were the most successful and were the most likely to survive over time. And some of them are still there today, like the Windsors and people like the Bourbons and some of those. And you see exactly the same thing happening with the old industrial bourgeoisie. The ones that have managed to reinvent themselves within a contemporary socio-cultural and socio-economic and technological framework are the ones that are continuing to be the most successful. And that's why you find these ultra elites like the Rockefeller and Ford and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and all of that, Morgan and all of that kind of stuff. You see that they are aligned with the new middle class and with the tech oligarchs, with Silicon Valley, with the mass media, with New Wall Street, like BlackRock and that kind of stuff, because they're simply they have the means of adjusting to the changing zeitgeist. So they're reinventing themselves as this new, woke elite. It's like Rockefeller plus wokeism. And that's exactly what happened in the Industrial Revolution. The old royal houses and aristocratic dynasties that managed to adjust to the changing times, that came with the Enlightenment, classical liberalism, capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. Those were the ones that were the most durable over time. And a lot of those are still here. Like Queen Elizabeth II, for example, one time she was asked, what is your opinion of socialism and capitalism? And she says, well, we're older than all of that. Meaning we represent a much older society, a much older elite, a much more superior elite. Basically saying, the whole socialism, capitalism thing, that's just for the little people to fight over. We're over and above all that. And that's what's happening now, where a lot of the super elite are really over and above, the whole, industrial bourgeoisie versus digital bourgeoisie conflict, and are able to reinvent themselves according to the times. So that's the class dynamic that we're really facing today.
All right, Alec.
Okay, so Todd, I'll go back to your previous comment. My apologies for the misunderstanding. So the point is not so much culture war, but class war that it conceals. So I'll start from the beginning. I still maintain that the culture war will become less relevant. We're just not going to be talking about this in a decade. There is not going to be a winner and a loser, but that leaves us with the question, what about the class war? There is a famous American saying that losses must lie where they fall. Does this mean that we're always prone to have an extreme inequality, just like Brazil? Maybe, maybe not. If we go back to the 1940s, 1950s, we saw the Great Compression. In fact, even Paul Krugman went so far as to write about the Great Compression that went from the 40s to the 70s. And Michael Linden, his book, The Land of Promise, wrote about the glorious 30 years. So that was the time when the middle class flourished. And I dare say that even before the Industrial Revolution, wealth inequality was not as extreme. Though, as Keith points out, that it seems to be that we're heading into the kind of a first turning that happened after the Civil War. Not so much the kind of a civil war, the kind of a first turning that happened in the 40s and 50s, where there will be an entrenched class conflict, and the elites will make no secret of their contempt for those who are less well off. That may or may not happen, and this brings me to a book that commonly that discusses the many ways in which inequality can shrink. This is the antidote to Piketty. Piketty maintains that that there is a conflict between capital and labor, and the wealth inequalities always grow. But Walter Scheidel argues that in the Great Leveler, that there are four circumstances under which inequality can shrink. That's civil wars, which we had in the 19th century. It helped diminish inequality, but not quite as much as we hoped. Total war, that happened in the 1940s and the 1950s. Plagues, well, we just might have another viral outbreak, who knows? And finally, revolutions. Who is to say that we're not going to have any one of these in the next 5 to 10 years? And maybe we came dangerously close to a civil war last week. The attempted assassination really could have brought us to the brink of a civil war. And who's to say that a total war will not happen as it did in the last fourth turn? We are at the tail end of the fourth turn, and now it is more likely than ever. So civil war, totally not off the table. A revolution, entirely possible, though less probable. And of course, a plague. Look at what happened with COVID. Who is to say that this is a once in a century event? It may very well happen again. And that will be the Great Leveler that Walter Scheidel talks about. This is one historically documented way of bridging inequality. Now, in the chat, Florian made a really interesting comment that I will quote at length. Here he writes, I think the adoption of libertarian principles by conservatives has created a spiritual void. Plus, if your ideal society is predicated on live and let live, it is a danger of getting steamrolled by those that want to take over. So I have a couple of things to say about this. First of all, libertarianism is about that. It's not coming back until another awakening, which will be in the 2050s, 2060s. We're not seeing support for a decentralization. And I don't think, Florian, that you're correct to say that we're going to, the Bitcoin and crypto management, that these things have a bright future, because when millennials take over, they're very much biased against any kind of decentralization. That's very much a Gen X-ish way of looking at the world. And millennials outnumber Gen X. They're the dominant generation. Gen X, the recessive generation. I don't see that happening. However, what I think you're making a great point about a spiritual void, and it seems that you're implying that this may be a bad thing. I'll argue the opposite. In fact, a spiritual void is what we need. We need to bury the baby boomer legacy once and for all. We need to forget about spirituality for a generation, focus on what works. Now, recently, Richard Hanania published a wonderful book called The Origins of Woke, where he openly rejected Breitbart's thesis that politics is downstream from culture. No, Hanania did not write a book about moral values. He wrote a book for political activists, for lawyers like himself, who want to amend the Civil Rights Act and eliminate this nonsense about disparate impacts. This is where we can cut the wings of wokeism through political legislation, no nonsense, getting things done, and by working with our enemies. Richard Nixon famously said that the professors are the enemy, the media are the enemy, the nonprofits are the enemy. Write it down 100 times on the blackboard and never forget it. Yeah, despite this, Richard Nixon collaborated actively with the Democrats, and he got a lot done. This is the spirit of compromise that we need, and we need a spiritual void to make that happen. And we can only hope that one of these four great levelers will put an end to this boomer-driven class war. Not to say that I'm rooting for another plague, a civil war, a revolution, or a total war, but that may be just what we need, and that may be inevitable at this point.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, so it may well be that crypto will not survive once millennials come in power, but I don't quite see how it will perish. It may be that it doesn't get so much power that I think it will, but it's difficult just by the nature of it. It's difficult to ban it, because if people decide to trade exclusively in Bitcoin, what are you going to do? I mean, this is just a decentralized computer program that is impossible to ban, right? This could also be made difficult to use if there's no possibility to exchange crypto into dollars or other currencies, right? The other thing, if you have a spiritual void, I agree that's a good thing if you want to establish something completely new. However, and maybe that's also something that will determine how our future looks like. If there's a void, it gets filled up by the people that want it the most, right? So you could imagine that there's a generation that that really wants to get back to principles of community and togetherism, like some millennial politics, millennial visions, right? They might fill out that void, and that may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. It may be that it's even palatable to conservatives in the future.
Okay, so I think we'll move into the closing statements. So what I'll say is I'll just briefly recap what I'm getting at with education. Firstly, as an indicator that the culture war wasn't what the proponents who were engaging in it purported it to be, was the fact that the conservatives had completely punted and abandoned the educational system. They don't raise children to be teachers. They don't really fund education. It's a complete abdication, and of course, in that case, you're just going to lose by default. So you have to start asking questions: what's going on here? And then, second of all, the American system, which was based on self-government and active civic engagement, was based off of a classical education. Self-government is a philosophical concept where, if you look at all Greek philosophy, what they're talking about is they differ on how to do it, and that's where all the differences and arguments come about, but that you need to control yourself. so that you can be a citizen in the polis. And then the same would go for the idea of just liberal education in general, where for example, if you read the Federalist Papers, they're just a history lesson. The Federalist Papers are discussing prior political systems that were close to what the U.S. was trying to do in the 1780s and where they failed and succeeded. That's classical education. And so the institutions and cultural values that America had are now gone because the mechanism by which they were generated, the educational process, was systematically replaced from probably 1913 with the Rockefellers up to like 1945, and it was more or less complete. And then up to the 60s with the writings of Alan Bloom and the closing of the American mind, and that the recovery of that is essential. And you could arguably it's a kind of right-coded conservative thing, but there were a lot of liberals back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that also valued this kind of education. So it doesn't necessarily have to be hard right-coded. Final thoughts, Keith?
Yeah, my take on the future of the culture war is that we actually have a number of precedents we can draw on to see how that's going to unfold. If we go back and we look at the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, we see there were the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century in America, France, 1848, and all of that. And eventually, bourgeois republicanism got to be pretty much the standard norm. And even though remnants of the old system even today remain, all of that eventually died down. There was eventually some kind of peace settlement, and everybody lived happily ever after, so to speak. And then after that, we saw the rise of socialism, the historic labor movement, and all that kind of stuff. And eventually some kind of settlement there was reached where the trade unions and socialist parties and labor parties were all incorporated into the framework of bourgeois capitalist republicanism. And then in the 68 era, 60s and 70s, we saw the cultural revolution of that time period. And I think what we're seeing now is the consolidation of all of that. And I think eventually there'll be some settlement there where, for example, it'll be recognized that, okay, some people are gay, some people are transgender. The number of people claiming that will probably level off because it won't be a status symbol anymore or a fad or something. And other people will look at it like, well, okay, some people are gay or transgender, just like some people are snake handlers or vegans or, Jehovah's Witnesses or something. And, you may not like it or whatever, but it is what it is. And that's true of all these kinds of culture wars. There'll be some kind of settlement in the long run, and the intensification of that is no longer what it is today. But then at that point, there'll be a new wave of rebellion against something else. My prediction is that around mid 21st century, so, a quarter of a century from now, I'll be in my 80s then, so I may not be here. But my prediction is that around mid 20th century, there's going to be another wave of rebellion similar to the 1960s or similar to, say, the labor movement of, say, the late 19th, early 20th century, or maybe some of the movements of the early 19th century, like transcendentalism or the Great Awakenings or the abolitionism. There's going to be some wave of social rebellion that comes along in mid 21st century. And I suspect it's going to have a socioeconomic component. I think, like I said, I think what we're seeing now is kind of like the bourgeoisie versus aristocracy conflict of the late 18th, early 19th century. But by mid 21st century, it's going to be more like it's something more akin to the proletarian versus bourgeois conflict. I mean, it won't be that because it's a different set of cultural and technological and economic frameworks. But it'll be something like that. It'll be a revolt by the common people against the economic elites.
All right. Final thoughts, Alex.
Well, so Keith, I'm going to agree with you that an awakening is likely. That's the cycle. But what comes before that? We're in the middle of the fourth turn, and we're almost done with that, it would seem. Or perhaps will last a little longer because baby boomers seem to be more resilient than we expect. They're not dying for some reason. Their life expectancy is shortening, yet there's still enough of them in public life. So how do we foresee this fourth turning ending? I think there has to be a cataclysm. All fourth turning have a crisis to begin with, and we had one in 08. And there was a crisis to wrap them up. Which of these four is going to happen? A revolution, a civil war, a plague, or a total war? I don't know, but I do think a civil war is the most likely outcome. And that's the topic that we've discussed on one of our previous shows a couple of months back. This is going to radically change the culture. I can't tell you who's going to win, or how the war will be fought, or even what it will be fought with, or how long it will last. But whatever happens in the end, we're going to have a more uniform culture. We're going to have a culture where there is less value-driven conflict, and class war will be less of an issue. We are going to see a compression of income, which is exactly what we need. And I think that if anything, just 10 years after that, we'll be talking about how the spiritual void that Florian brought up is actually a problem. Remember how dull and drab the 1950s were? Well, I guess none of us actually remember it from memory. Well, we've read all about it, how sterile the culture was, how censored the press was, how difficult it was to express anybody's individuality. We will be growing sick of this, of the monotony and the dullness, and that's when there will be an awakening that Keith is talking about, and that's where I foresee that the new generation, the alpha, who are just being born now, they're going to rise, and they're going to have their own rage against the machines episodes, and that's where Todd, your topic about the role of machines in corrupting culture and exacerbating the class war is going to be even more relevant. I think it's somewhat it's waning in relevance now. It's declining because we're moving into a post-spiritual era. But I would not be surprised if 20, 30 years down the road, you'll be a senior citizen and you'll be lecturing college students on exactly that topic, who will be lapping it up. Who will
Oh, I hope so, Alec. I hope so.
So that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Okay, Florian, you get the last word.
Okay, maybe I hope I can make it as friendly as a last word as I can be. I thought about it, thought forth and back, what could be a cataclysm in our future? Where I just can't see a cataclysm in the beginning of the 20th century. You could see that, the great wars of the 20th century were kind of foreshadowed by the Crimean War and by the row of Balkan wars that came right before the First World War. And you could even think that probably people thought back then that what became First World War was just going to be the Third Balkan War, and let's end the trouble in the Balkans one and forever, and that became the World War, the First World War. So I don't see anything like that, anything like that in the air around us. I don't see that. But what I do see is, which is also could also lead to a cataclysmic event, is the more and more, the third world more and more goes into the first world, like mass immigration and that. It reminds me of, I forgot which century that was. I think it was before Christ, 700 or 800 before Christ. There was a very stable or seemingly stable regimes around the Nile Delta. Those were very stable governments, and then from nowhere you had some boat people who were coming in, basically small invasions here and there that eventually brought the entire empires to fall. And I'm afraid I'm seeing the immigration as a little bit like that. I do believe there's an element of invasion army to it, and that could be one of the larger conflicts that is waiting for us. The nicer version is that everything will be integrated, everything goes fine, because you have the internet and social media, and people can basically form their own community in a decentralized manner, at least with like-minded people, right? It's a little bit like the contrast between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. In America, there was never a terror of the American Revolution because people could just move out of West. There was enough space, and kind of the internet gives us some spiritual space where people can expand. The question is whether that's going to be enough to prevent any cataclysm from happening, because we still live on resources that exist in the real world.
All right. Well, thank you again, Keith, Alec, and Florian. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.